if you'll notice something very, very important, a disciple never came to Jesus and said, "Teach us to preach." A disciple never came to Jesus and said, "Teach us to walk on water." A disciple never came to Jesus and said, "Teach us to raise the dead." A disciple never came to Jesus and said, "Teach us to cast out demons." Now, if you were to want to know how to play basketball, you probably wouldn't come to me because I know so little about basketball. You would try to find out what my expertise truly was, and then you would ask me about that. You ask a man about his expertise. You ask a man about the thing which most impresses you about that man. I believe that without a doubt, the greatest demonstration of divine power was seen not when Jesus Christ raised the dead, and not when He walked on water, but when He prayed. And I believe that when the disciples saw Jesus pray, they could not believe their eyes. They could not believe even what their ears were telling them. Jesus was a man of prayer. A man of prayer. Now let me ask you a question. When people hear you pray, do they hear someone who knows God? Do they hear the rhythm of a religion? Do they hear words that have been taught to you by other men? Do they hear form? Do they hear intellect? Or do they hear a man or a woman or a child who spends much time in the presence of God? Has anyone ever come to you and said, "Teach me to preach like you preach"? Well, that may be something to boast about, but not before God. Has anyone ever come to you and said, "Teach me to administrate like you administrate"? Has anyone ever come to you and said, "Teach me to pray"? I am not much of a man, but I have had the privilege in my life to be in the presence of many men used by God. And the one thing that I noticed, they had very little in common, except one thing. When they bowed their knee, something unusual happened. There's a saying, when someone achieves a certain thing, he may look over and with a twinkle in his eye say, "You can't learn that. You've got to be born with that. You can't fake prayer." Jesus was a man of prayer. And when He prayed, people saw the difference. Now, I want to look for a moment at the idea that Jesus was a man of prayer. And I've just scribbled down here a bunch of verses, and I'm going to kind of read a hodgepodge of verses that you might come to understand the importance of prayer in the life of Jesus Christ, and then come to understand that if prayer was so important to the incarnate Son of the living God, then how much more important should prayer be to us? How much more should we depend upon prayer? Jesus lived a life of prayer. That's the first thing I want you to see. In Luke 5:16 it says, "But Jesus Himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray." You know, oftentimes when we find something that we greatly enjoy, as opposed to what we grudgingly must do, we try to slip away to it. A man might want to avoid his yard duty by slipping away to watch a ball game. A man may come into work early so he can slip away to go hunting. A wife may want to slip away to go to the mall. They slip away to the things that they most enjoy. Isn't it a crime that Jesus Christ and the labor of the kingdom seems almost to be work that we want to slip away from? I heard tell of a story of an evangelist. He got off the plane and was received by the pastors, and immediately they took him out to play golf. I don't have much of a problem with that. Never played golf myself. But they took him out to the golf course, and that's a fine thing. I guess they saw that he needed to rest, and as they were going out there across whatever you cross to do whatever you do when you play golf, the evangelist just happened to mention, he said, "Well, you know, the Lord is so good. The other day he was just..." And the preacher stopped him and says, "Let's not talk shop out here. This is the place where we're going to rest. The only place you'll ever rest is in Jesus Christ." And you know when you're walking with God, when you slip away to Him, when you say, there's so much I have to do, so much grudging work, so much labor, I just wish that I could slip away to Him for a moment, because He's the one to whom I escape. He's the place I rest. When prayer becomes a labor, we're not like the Christ. We're not like Jesus. But it says He would slip away into the wilderness and pray. Notice He would go into the wilderness. My friend, the world, even the church, is just so filled up with noise. So filled up with noise that every once in a while, especially those of you who are pastors, you have got to slip away. And you've got to go to a wilderness where no one can find you and seek your God. And be very careful that sometimes you don't take along all those books with you. Because to many, Jesus Christ can just become proper exegesis, proper hermeneutic, a thing to be studied instead of a person to be loved. Jesus would slip away. In Matthew 14:23, it says, after He had sent the crowds away, He went up on the mountain by Himself to pray, and when it was evening, He was there alone. Someone said, why did Jesus need to pray so much? He was the incarnate Son of God. We're going to talk about that. But let me show you just the foolishness of that question. Could it just be possible that He always wanted to slip away and be alone with God simply because He loved Him? Because He loved Him.
Does prayer change God's mind? And I said, well, if we ask the question in that manner, obviously, to ask that question is to answer it. I mean, the only answer I can give to it is not simply by saying, no, prayer doesn't change God's mind. The only real answer I can give to that question is, of course not. What could be further from your imagination than that your prayer or my prayer would have the power or the influence to change the mind of the Almighty? I mean, just think about that for just 2 minutes, and you will see that to ask the question is to answer it. Because what would have to happen for God to change His mind? What kind of a view of God do we have when we assume that God has worked out a plan, and He has His plan A, and He's about to implement this plan that grows out of His perfect knowledge, of His absolute wisdom, and His total righteousness and integrity? So He's utterly incapable of having an evil design, and He's incapable of having a foolish plan, isn't He? And so He has His plan A, and He's going to implement it, and then all of a sudden, something He hasn't anticipated takes place. You begin to pray. And you say, well, God, could you please change this plan a little bit? I would prefer that you do it a different way. Have you considered this, and have you considered that? And suddenly, you're God's guidance counselor. And you get Him to change His mind because you persuade Him that His first plan was not a good one. Or you give Him information that He lacked before you talk to Him. Now think about it. What kind of a God do you have if you think that you have to inform Him of the details of what's going on down here? Well, the Scriptures tell us that the Lord knows what you need before you ask of it. And what's the conclusion? Therefore, you don't need to bother to ask. Isn't that amazing? That the Father, who knows everything about it, He knows every hair on your head, He knows every thought in your mind, every word that is going to, before it's even formed on your lips, He knows what you're going to say before you say it. There's nowhere that you can escape from His presence. He knows you inside and out. He knows what you need, but He still says, come and tell me what you need. Now, beloved, when He does that, that is not for His benefit. It is not for His education. And it's not for His edification. Who's it for? The answer's obvious, isn't it? When He asks us to come and tell Him what our concerns are and our needs, He's inviting us into the sacred presence of the Almighty in heaven itself, and to say, come and talk to me for our benefit. Because we walk away from that communication, from that experience of speaking our needs and our concerns before the Lord, encouraged and at peace because we have been with Him in that discourse.
It says in Luke 6:12-13, it was at this time that he went off to a mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had to make a really tough decision? Did you ever pass the entire night in prayer to do so? If you say no, I say to you, behold, we found a man stronger than Jesus. Isn't it amazing that the Christ would slip away and spend the entire night in prayer to discern the Father's voice, to pick the men that had to be picked? But we've got the upper hand on that. That's not so much needed anymore. He goes on, Matthew 26:36, Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. Sit here while I go over there and pray. Who could forget Gethsemane? Who could forget the war that was fought in that place? My friend, when he got up off his knees, the battle was over. The war was fought there. How many things do we have to fight with? How many Philistines do we have to put up with that stay in the land and they're like thorns to us? Why? Because we do not take the matter by the horns. We do not go to the Lord and wrestle until the victory is won. Jesus Christ overcame in that garden, and He overcame by struggling through it in prayer and gaining the victory. That passage, this kind, only comes out through prayer and fasting. That just doesn't have to do with demons, my dear friend. There are so many mountains in your life, so many obstacles in your life, so many things in your life that seek to derail you, to stop you. And they're going to stay there because some of those things just don't go away by counseling. They go away by falling on your face before God until He delivers you. Jesus was a man of prayer. He showed it in every aspect of His life. And He goes on, Jesus taught on prayer. He taught prayer. The Scriptures are so filled with the teachings of Jesus Christ on prayer that there's just nothing we can do with that tonight. There's two passages that I want to point out, and they're both found in Luke 18. In verse 1, He says, Now He was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart. That's the teaching of Jesus Christ. Right there. If you want to sum up everything He taught about prayer, we ought to pray at all times. Now, for you young men here, let me just teach you something that'll help you. I hear so many young men today saying, well, I don't have really a specific time in which I pray. I'm more, throughout my day, I just kind of practice the presence of God. But I don't really have that secret place I go to. Let me tell you something, young man. There is no way you can learn to practice the presence of God if you do not spend much time in secret prayer. The power to practice the presence of God, the power to live a life of prayer, to always be speaking with the Father, that is born out of secret time with the Lord, segments of time with the Lord in prayer. And He said we ought to be praying always and not to lose heart. The initiating of prayer is never a problem. Do you realize that? You have initiated so many petitions before the throne. The question is, have you wrestled them through? Have you pressed on in to lay hold? Have you kept going? Are there petitions in your heart, in your mind, down on pieces of paper that possibly have been there for 15 years? But you say to the Lord, I will not let you go. It is so easy to initiate prayer, but to persevere in that praying. So He said we ought to pray, and we shouldn't lose heart, because losing heart is the very end of all praying. In John 5:30, one of my favorite texts in the Bible, it says this, I can do nothing on my own initiative. I can do nothing on my own initiative. How much do we do on our own initiative? Is it not the great sin to take the matter into our own hands? And we've been taught that even in our own culture. Man needs a car, doesn't have money for it. What does he do? Well, he goes to the bank, takes the matter into his own hands by his own initiative, and he gets the job done, and he's in bondage to it. Instead of a man saying, I need a car, I have no money. Father, I need a house, I have no money. Father, I want to do this thing in the name of Jesus Christ and in the ministry, but Father, I will initiate nothing. Show me, lead me, guide me. Absolute surrender to Him. Absolute surrender. It's not something I'm giving testimony about with regards to myself, but it is something I'm telling you about with regard to Jesus Christ. I want you to see Him, yes, as God in the flesh, but I want you to see Him as a man totally submitted to the will of God. And I want you to see that that is what you are called to. Prayer is a little thing unless this giant is first slain. It is the end of self-will and submitting ourselves to Jesus Christ. There ought to be a way in which we could answer every question like this. Someone says, well, why did you go there? Or why did you do this? The answer, because I believed it to be God's will. Well, that's an absolutely great opportunity that's open to you. No, I have no opportunity except the doing of God's will. If all the doors in all of creation fly open and God says, stop, then you'll bring glory to God by stopping. And you'll save yourself from a whole lot of peril.
But let's not flatter ourselves to the place where we think that our wisdom is greater than His wisdom, or that our knowledge is such that we can give Him information that He didn't previously have. Well, again, when I give that kind of an answer to people, to the question, does prayer change God's mind? When I say, no, it doesn't change God's mind, because God's mind knew what you were going to pray before you prayed it. And that knowledge was factored in to His plan all along. Well, then you say, well, then again, that sounds like it's all programmed and there's no reason to pray. Well, let's ask the question another way. Not does prayer change the mind of God, but does prayer change things? Does prayer have any impact on what actually comes to pass? And the answer to that biblically is yes. And not just a simple yes, but a by all means. Let's take a moment to look at James's teaching on this subject in the 5th chapter of his book. Beginning in verse 13, we read these words. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church. Let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it didn't rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit.
If there ever was a man who had a reason to say, Lord, I can't pray now. There's just too many hurting people that I still haven't touched. There's too much ministry to do. I don't have time to pray. If anyone ever had the right to say that, at that moment, it was Jesus Christ. I love what Martin Luther said one time. He said, I have so much work, activity to do today. I must pray at least 3 hours or I will never get done. That's the direct opposite of us, isn't it? I have so much to do today. I have no time to pray. Look what we're saying. We are saying with that declaration, I'm going to go out and accomplish things in the power of my own. The greatest need. I don't know about you, but I see the greatest need seeking the Lord as Jesus sought Him and being in His presence and being empowered by Him. What cannot be overcome in prayer? Answer me. What cannot be done by the hand of the Almighty? Answer me. What can be done by your feeble arms? Answer me. He can take down the iron curtain in a day. He can convert a nation in an hour. Call upon Him. Believe Him.